Lunar module, commonly called the LEM, America's fourth manned spacecraft, following Mercury, Gemini, and its mate Apollo on the path to the moon. But this spacecraft is the first in a new generation, not designed to carry men into space, not built to return men safely to Earth. Instead, this far-fetched flying machine, so ungainly looking, will serve as a ferry boat, carrying 2 American astronauts from the Apollo mothership to a landing on the moon and back. But that historic mission, planned for midsummer, will not be flown at all unless we've proved that LEM, with man at the controls, can perform perfectly in space. Proving it is the goal of Apollo 9.
This is a CBS News special report. The flight of Apollo 9. This morning, the launch of astronauts McDivitt, Schweickart, and Scott. Reporting from the CBS News Apollo headquarters, Kennedy Space Center, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
And it's T-minus 58 minutes and counting here at the Kennedy Space Center with the Apollo 5 rocket and the Apollo 9 spacecraft atop it, waiting to go at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, with the countdown going perfectly so far. The astronauts are buttoned into the command module there atop that 363-foot-high rocket complex, ready to go on what perhaps is the most dangerous mission yet in the Apollo program, and a vital one if we are to get a man on the moon this year, as the late President Kennedy promised. The flight is to test, as we heard a moment ago, the LEM, the lunar module, which will be the craft to ferry man from the command module to the surface of the moon and back. It does not operate in an Earth environment. It operates only in space, the first true space vehicle we've ever had, therefore, and the men who ride it on this mission in Earth orbit, 150 miles or so above the Earth, must get it back to the command module after they once detach from that command ship in order to return to Earth. The major events on this mission today, the launch, of course, which is always a hair-raising part of any space mission, and then the docking of the command ship with the lunar module, the extraction of it from its garage that is carried into space with it, the top of that spacecraft, top of the rocket, and that is the principal mission for today. And then on Wednesday, the first test of the lunar module's descent engine. On Thursday, a spacewalk by 33-year-old Rusty Schweickart, youngest member of this crew, the LEM pilot. He will take a 2-hour and 15-minute walk from the LEM back to the spacecraft, to the command ship, and then back to the LEM again. And on Friday, the LEM flies for the first time on its own. The crew, Colonel James McDivitt, U.S. Air Force, 39 years old, veteran of the Korean War and many combat flights there, the veteran of the Gemini 4 flight, when the late Ed White made his spacewalk. The command module pilot is Colonel David Scott, 36 years old, a veteran of the Gemini 8 flight, which was the only flight that had to come back and make an emergency landing in all of our 18 flights in the space program. And the lunar module pilot, a civilian, but a National Guard flyer who had some active service in the Air Force, Russell Schweickart, 33 years old. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 9 will continue in a moment. It's T-minus 53 minutes and counting. There haven't been any delays in this count. There was a brief flurry of activity out on the launch pad a little earlier this morning when a helium valve that pressurizes the third stage of the spacecraft, and the booster, that is, seemed to be malfunctioning, but that was corrected in short order. It did delay the astronauts' departure from their crew quarters, however, and their ingress into the spacecraft by about 8 or 10 minutes, but apparently they've caught up the time, and the countdown is going as planned and is on time for an 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, on-time departure. The duration of this flight is to be 9 days, 22 hours, and 47 minutes, with splashdown at about 10:15, 10:17, something like that, a week from Thursday in the Atlantic, 185 miles southwest of Bermuda, where the helicopter carrier, the Guadalcanal, will be standing by for the recovery. You see the venting of the liquid oxygen in the spacecraft there a moment ago. That full 363 feet, 6,600,000 pounds of it standing there. It weighs half again as much as a small destroyer. You might also note in the background a very heavy cloud cover, because that is the condition here in Florida this morning. On this coast, at any rate, the sky is supposed to be solidly overcast at around 5,000 feet at launch time, some 52 minutes from now, and that solid cloud cover is just about over us now. Winds are supposed to be from the east-southeast at 10 knots. That's not the most favorable direction, blowing back onto the Merritt Island Space Center here, but it is acceptable. Temperature around 64 degrees. None of those conditions are perfect. The visibility won't be very good on this launch from the ground, but they are acceptable conditions for launch. During this flight, there also will be a live television from space, the first test of a new Westinghouse television camera, the camera that will be used on the surface of the moon. The previous cameras we have seen, RCA cameras, which have worked so well in the past, have been supplanted now by this Westinghouse camera, which was the plan all along, a camera that can stand the long pressurization on the moon. It weighs almost twice what that former camera did. We'll have the two transmissions, one on Wednesday morning around 9:30. That will be just to the interior of the lunar landing module. And then around 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon of this week, the walk of Rusty Schweickart outside the spacecraft. Let's look at the astronaut activities as they got prepared for this flight this morning, as they awoke at 5:45 at their crew quarters some 5 miles from Launch Pad 39A. Here is the command pilot. That was not McDivitt. I thought at first it was. His hairline's very similar to McDivitt's. One of the several technicians who were at the breakfast with them. Here they are as they begin to suit up. This is Scott. This is Rusty Schweickart, the lunar module pilot. Schweickart, 33, MIT graduate. Scott is 36. This is McDivitt, the commander, 39-year-old man who is in charge of this flight and has to make the go, no-go decisions. Here they are in their spacesuits, carrying their portable air conditioner equipment as they leave the crew quarters for the special van, which takes them the 5 miles along these roads across the marshes of the Cape and Merritt Island to the launch pad. At this point, they were running about 5 to 8 minutes late because of that delay with the helium regulator I mentioned. There was some delay in getting them started from the crew quarters. The van sat there for several more minutes. Inside, they can link up with other air conditioner equipment if they desire, or stay on the portable equipment which they carry with them. The crew at the crew quarters sends them off with a good luck sign. This their last ride in a wheeled vehicle. Their next trip is going to be on top of that Saturn V with its 7.5 million pounds of thrust in the first stage. More powerful than any vehicle man has ever built. there you get a good view of it. A little earlier this morning as the van approached, which you see there in the bottom of the picture. That structure has to hold up this whole 6.5 million pounds of vehicle and all of its fuel. The fuel is included in that 6,600,000 pounds. The venting you see is of that liquid oxygen, which is down in the minus 200 degree range and boils off in an Earth environment. As it sits there on the pad, they have to continually push more of the liquid oxygen into the vehicle because it does boil away. That's what you see, the steam vent to the liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen is used as the oxidizer. Since there is no oxygen in space, and it takes oxygen to burn anything, including a rocket engine, you've got to take your oxygen along with you. So they take it along in liquid form. The astronauts you saw just there, crossing over with the suit technicians into a elevator which takes them up to the top of the Rector base, and then over to another elevator on up the total distance of 320 feet to where their command ship rests atop the Saturn V rocket. There to the first level. If they were coming back down that way, and here you see them crossing the short catwalk from the umbilical tower and that high-speed elevator over to the White Room. Here the technicians have been working through the night, and for the last 4 hours the backup crew has been working in there testing all of the systems of the spacecraft, waiting for the prime crew, the ones that will fly today, to arrive. They are then helped into the spacecraft and they themselves check out everything and also check the pressurization of their suits, which are pressurized in case anything should happen in space and they lost pressure in the spacecraft itself. They could still get back safely and survive the hostile environment of outer space. Nelson Benton is at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, and I wonder, Nelson, what the mood is at Houston this morning on the moments before this crucial flight.
Walter, the atmosphere here was described in one word by Eugene Kranz, who's the flight director for Apollo 9. He called it electric. And perhaps the reason for that electricity is this thing that's standing behind me. That's the lunar module. It must behave properly on its own with 2 astronauts in it. It must behave properly with relation to the command service module, the sort of mothership for the flight. It is the trickiest mission that Apollo astronauts have tried to fly so far, indeed the trickiest mission of manned space flight. It is more difficult, officials say, than the historic moon flight of Apollo 8. And many officials here say that they would be surprised if Apollo 9 does all that it is setting out to do. The Mission Control Center, which is the nerve center for this flight, was powered up yesterday at about midday. There are more people there now than there have been for previous missions because there must be people and control consoles for the LIM and for the portable life support system, the packs that the astronauts will use while the spacecraft are depressurized. All told, there are about 30% more people in the entire Mission Control Center than there have been on previous flights. It's configured just about the same way as it will be when we make the flight to the moon. The major concern, of course, is the first 5 days in which the LIM will be worked out. That's the busy part. And then there are 5 rather uneventful days. And some say, well, why have those uneventful days? Well, Chris Kraft, who's the director of flight operations, said that anytime you put 3 men on top of a Saturn, you get all out of the flight that you can. Walter?
Nelson, we'll be coming back to you from time to time at Houston, the Manned Space Center, where, of course, the controls for this flight are. Here at the Merritt Island Space Center, the Kennedy Space Center as it's called. It's not really Cape Kennedy any longer, you know. We're back a few miles and a little north of the Cape itself. But here They control only the launch phase, and then the control goes immediately to Houston. And Nelson will be checking in with you frequently during the next 10 days, and particularly in the next 5, as you point out, which are the crucial ones to this mission. There is an experiment, however, later on in the flight that is going to be conducted that we'd be remiss if we didn't mention at all, because perhaps it'll have as much influence on all of our futures as anything else that takes place on this flight. And that is, in the last couple of days of the flight, some photography from orbit checking our environment. We have found that we can tell from space a great deal about this world we live in with photographs. We can tell, for instance, how crops are doing, where they're likely to fail. We can begin to see the colors change. With infrared photography, we can tell something about the temperatures of the oceans and where fish are likely to be. Tell something about anomalies, things that are going wrong with the crust of our Earth. They even believe that eventually they may be able to tell something about population with infrared photography by just the heat of the number of bodies there below. Well, a series of experiments and photographs over 2 days, the latter part of this flight, is going to add a great deal to our store of knowledge in that new science, which may have a great deal to do with all of our futures. This lunar module, which we're talking about so much today, we might explain to you just a little bit, something of it here, before we get into more detail in the flight itself. This is the service module, so-called, and the command module. We have been used to seeing fly around like this. It is this that went to the moon, that took the Apollo 8 crew, Frank Borman and his fellows, to the moon and back in Apollo 8 in December. This part detaches and comes back, the command module, which I can't seem to get loose here. I assume they'll be able to do it when they get ready to come home. The service module is jettisoned, and this command module part is that part that comes back, 12 feet high. Now, it docks with the lunar module, which is this part here, by simply slipping in with a docking collar, very much like that, and I hope also with a little more ease than I found to do it. They do have about a foot of leeway, but it's a very tight maneuver as they come in. Actually, there's a probe on the command module that goes into a funnel-like drogue, it's called, a docking ring on the lunar module. That probe fits right in. They can be 1 foot off, but not more, and still slip into a docking position. It's a pretty tricky maneuver. This is the lunar module itself. It's 22 feet high, just about evenly divided between these two. This ascent stage a little bit larger in height than the descent stage. This is actually 2 vehicles. The 2 men who go through a little tunnel down into this vehicle when they are docked stand up in it, up in the front. They stand, they do not sit down, stand in an area about the size of a couple of telephone booths, Schweickart over on the right and McDivitt over here on the left. They look out a couple of windows here and a docking window up at the top. All around here are various antennae. The radar antenna for a rendezvous, an S-band antenna for communication with Earth, hi-fi antennas and other stuck around on the outside of the lunar module. Now, this entire thing goes down to the surface of the moon, this being the descent stage. There's a little step here, a little front porch it's called, and 9 steps to the moon, which the men will descend when they get to the moon's surface. Once this engine under here has fired, and it is throttleable from 1,050 to about 9,800 pounds. That is, it can be speeded up or slowed down to settle this gently on the moon. That settles down on these, roughly 1 yard wide pads. These come out once the module has separated from its garage that takes it into space. Down on the moon, the men come out of this hatch, walk down on the moon's surface. When they get back in and ready to blast off, then this engine works in here to carry them back to the command ship circling the moon and waiting for them with 1 astronaut remaining aboard. On this particular mission, that astronaut remaining aboard is David Scott. Schweickart and McDivitt will be riding this LEM for the first time in space. This thing is not streamlined, it's not protected in any way because it's operating only in that benign atmosphere beyond the atmosphere. It's really not what we would refer to atmosphere. Out in space, where there is no oxygen, where there is no resistance to speed, where there are no winds to buffet it. It's so thin, as a matter of fact, to keep the weight down that, as McDivitt has said, he could put his foot through it if he was not too cautious. It is surrounded by a blanket to protect it from micrometeoroids and from the extreme heat out in space. The space, you know, it gets down to 450 degrees below zero and up to 450 degrees above, depending on whether you're facing the sun or not. And so one side of this vehicle could be 450 degrees cold and the other 450 degrees hot, but it will spin to equalize those temperatures so that it won't bake on one side and freeze on the other. Let's go to the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Company out in Bethpage, Long Island, which manufactures this vehicle, and there Steve Rowan and Scott McLeod are standing by. Steve, come in.
Walter, as you say, the LEM is a completely different vehicle. It's, of course, not aerodynamically designed to fly in the atmosphere, and therefore it's kind of an ugly-looking vehicle, I suppose, pretty to the engineers and pretty to the men who've worked with it, like Scott McLeod, Grumman's chief consulting pilot. Scotty, Walter has mentioned some of the things that the LEM must do. How does that make it different? First of all, of course, it doesn't have any streamlining outside.
Well, that's true, Steve. It doesn't require any streamlining, as Walter had mentioned. In addition, since we don't require any work in the atmosphere, we have no heat shield. The men cannot return to Earth in the LEM. They must go back to the command module first.
It's the first spacecraft with two engines, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It has, as Walter had mentioned, the throttleable descent engine and also an ascent engine.
So it's really two spacecraft in one.
Right.
And aside from that, and aside from, of course, the rendezvous radar and things it needs to get back to the command module, is it greatly different than any other spacecraft?
Well, no, it's not that different, Steve. What we've tried to do in the LEM is use everything that has been used in other spacecraft as much as possible.
This DISC-key, as we call it, the computer keyboard, is just about the same then as the one in the command module.
Yes, it is. All of our controls and displays, the 8-ball, our artificial horizon, and each one of the controls, as much as possible, is the same as the command module, so that when the crew comes into the LEM, they won't be going into an entirely different environment.
And, of course, the one thing that is different, Scotty, and Walter, is the fact that they don't have couches. They don't even have stools to sit on in the LEM, so they're going to have to stand up just as we'll be standing here to help describe their activities. Walter?
Scott, welcome to our CBS News space broadcast. First ever for Scott McLeod with us on this, and we're glad to have you aboard to show us through these LEM maneuvers.
Thank you, Walter.
Scott, by the way, that business of standing up really isn't a terrible chore since you're weightless anyway, as long as you've got some restraints to keep you from floating up and hitting your head on the ceiling there, huh?
Well, that's true. You have cables similar to these, if you can see them, that attach to the suit. And in addition, there is Velcro on the bottom of your boots and on the deck of the spacecraft. So this keeps you attached fairly firmly to the spacecraft.
Is that maybe the way we're going to walk around in space passenger vehicles of the future, with that Velcro on our boots?
Well, I guess we have the alternate of either something like Velcro or an artificial gravity.
A spinning of the spacecraft to create a gravity.
Yes.
Right. Well, we'll be back frequently. Stand by. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 9 will continue in a moment.